A very warm welcome to all of you from Ipsos. Today we'll be discussing about inflation, a topic which has impacted each and every one of us, be it individually, personally, or from a business perspective. In the next 50 minutes or so, we'll discuss how can we drive growth despite inflation, and we look at it from a consumer perspective as well as a business perspective. The agenda for today: in the first 15 minutes or so, we'll cover the consumer perspective. We'll see how consumers are dealing with inflation, how are they dealing with price hikes, what are their strategies to cope with it. And in the next 30 minutes, we'll discuss with a panel on how businesses are dealing with it and how can they drive growth. It gives me immense pleasure today to welcome the panel with me. We've got three senior industry leaders with us, Chandan from Nestle, Manjunath from Britannia, and Mahesh from L'Oreal, who will be joining Geeta in the panel discussion today. We'll then move to the Q&A section. For the last 10 minutes, we'll take the audience questions. You can keep posing your questions in the chat window, which you see on the side, as we speak, as things come into your mind, and we'll take them at the end. We then wrap up the session at 1, finally ending. So let's begin. Before we look into the consumer perspective, a look at the inflation rates for India. How have they spanned over the last 20 years? If we take a long-term view, we see that inflation is not new to India. It's something that's been coming to India, and especially in the phase of 2008 to 13, it was something which was very high. This is very unlike the Western economies, where we see that US, UK have had only a 3 to 4% average rate of inflation over the years. They're seeing this level of spikes for the very first time, while India is not experiencing it for the first time. And despite that, when we look at the growth rate of the Indian economy, we do see that we continue to do well. Our economy is definitely doing relatively better compared to other economies. Let's now look at what consumers have to say about inflation and price hikes, how it's impacting their daily lives. And we've drawn consumer insights from 3 key sources. Our recently launched India Bus solution, which is an omnibus across India. It's got a good spread across Gen Pop in India with a fair representation. We've got insights from social listening, where we've harnessed the intelligence of user-generated data, analyzed that to come up with insights. And the third source of our insights is our online community platform, something we set up especially on inflation as a topic. And we ask consumers to discuss about inflation through different questions which we post through them in discussion boards, polls, one-on-one chats, and the tasks that we assign to them. So let's now look at what consumers have to say about inflation. Like we saw, hard data on inflation, it's not new to India. The inflation rates are not new to India. Indian consumers also realize that it's been a perennial issue, which has had no solution in sight. It's been a persisting problem. At the same time, when we ask them what are their top 3 worries, among a lot of things which can worry us, we did see that inflation was one of the top worries. It is not the only worry, it is not the most dominant worry, but it is one of the top 2 worries which is impacting Indians. And this is in sharp contrast to something which we saw versus other countries. We do this global survey across 16 plus countries, and when we compare India data to other economies, we do see that inflation is a much bigger and a much more pressing problem, say in US, Australia, Spain, South America. It's much more than in India. We further tried to figure out how it's impacting Indians and what's the extent of impact, and saw that the extent of impact differs. 1 in 5 do feel that they are not impacted at all, while nearly half of them say that they are severely impacted by inflation. We tried to dig deep and figure out if there was a pattern in the people who were impacted and not impacted. And when we analyzed the data by family responsibilities, their life stage, their affluence levels, we did see that people who are in the mature life stages, have kids at home, are shouldering more family responsibilities and belong to the lower economic strata, the lower affluence levels. Those are the ones which are getting much more impacted by inflation. We then tried to see what's How does an average Indian consumer figure out that it's inflation time? What triggers his worry? We mind social conversations through whatever people are feeding onto the social media sites for the last 2 years and saw a pattern that every time the fuel price increase was taking place in India, the conversations around inflation started to peak up. So fuel price does signal inflation to the general Indian consumer. We further dig deep into the social insights data and saw that there was a sentiment attached to it. And not surprisingly, yes, there was a lot of negative sentiment attached to fuel price increases, to inflation in per se. When we ran through the conversations with a qualitative lens and tried to see how consumers are expressing themselves, we did see a lot of consumers discussing their plight about dealing with it, government not being able to do much about it, and the fact that every time there's a fuel increase, it's going to cascade into everyday items becoming costlier, be it their vegetables, fruits, or their grocery items. Everything has a cascading effect as fuel prices go up. We also saw, while as uh, while as business people, we've seen the power of magic price points. We do see that consumers do realize that inflation hits them in two ways. There is a direct price hike, which we pass on to the consumers, but consumers do also notice when we shrink quantities and the same goods for the same price is shrinking in quantity. So that is something consumers do realize. We tried to see if there is a difference by categories in the impact of inflation on them. And there was a clear correlation with the purchase frequency. The items which are much more purchased, which are frequently purchased, those are the ones where consumers are hit more by inflation. And also because there is a higher consciousness, a higher awareness of the prices at which they operate. So yes, the purchase frequency does determine the impact that the consumer feels on those goods. Further, what we tried to do was, we tried to see if this round of inflation was a bit different from the past rounds of inflation, because inflation wasn't new to India. And we did try to see whether there was something coming up there. Because this round of inflation is coming up after a heavy and prolonged pandemic phase, we did see that consumers talk about their plight of sitting on a smaller pool of savings. So there have been a lot of mentions around in inflation, my salary was cut, my business did not do well, I had to spend a lot of time and money on health expenses because me or my family got impacted with the virus itself. So they are today sitting on a smaller pool of savings, which gives them a lot of worry because at the same time, COVID has only amplified the need to save for the rainy day. So their stress, while they're dealing with inflation in the present circumstances, the need to save more and have more for the future to be confident about it is much more. So COVID is impacting them in two ways, both from a past perspective as well as the future perspective, which only makes the consumer feel more pressured to manage his expenses. And now let's see how consumers are dealing with this management of finances. What are they doing to manage it? We did see that savings, which is a value ingrained in our Indian culture, we are a value conscious society. We are quite apt at managing our purse strings. So all these things, whether it's reprioritizing, buying in bulk, seeking value, seeking discounts, promotions, all of this does come to the foray. But there are two key things which decide on whether the consumer will do it or not. One is the financial circumstances of me as an individual and my family. And the second is criticality of the category. So a lot of categories which are critical, important, priority cannot be done about. Consumers do look at, buying them in bulk, seeking discounts and still buying them. At the same time, they do postpone discretionary spends for categories which are luxuries and they want it. At the same time, while they're doing all this to manage their purse, at the same time, all of this is giving them a lot of stress. The curtailing that they're doing at their end to meet their needs is only a compromise. It's not a real solution. Their rational mind is leading them to manage their purse strings and reduce the spends, but the heart is desiring for much more. It puts them in agony. It dampens their quest for progress in life. They do desire their luxuries and the good things that they've gotten used to, but they do feel embarrassed when they have to curtail their spends. Hence, for them, this curtailing is not a real solution. What they really look forward to is to power their aspirations, they're actively pursuing means to increase their income. For them, the best way to beat inflation is look forward to increasing their income with whatever alternate sources they come up with, whether it's putting time in upskilling themselves and getting better at the job, or it's about short-term income boost, or managing my savings, or investing the funds that I today have in better areas, finding out more about it so that I can save for the rainy day. Let's now hear consumers share their own perspective in their own words through the video, which are bits that they loaded on the online community when we ran them with them. We kept posing questions to them and we sought their views on different aspects, and the consumers were uploading videos in the community. So this is drawn from there. Let's look at what consumers had to say.
इन्फ्लेशन महंगाई जो थी वो थोड़ी थोड़ी बढ़ती थी, सही है, हर साल भर साल। बट आफ्टर द लॉकडाउन महंगाई एकदम से बढ़ी है।
बिफोर 3 इयर्स जितना खर्चा हमारा 2-3 दिन चलता था उतना आज एक दिन में यूज़ हो जाता है।
I try to buy in bulk, जैसे कि 25 kg की गोनी होती है राइस की। अगर हम ज़्यादा क्वांटिटी में लेते हैं तो कुछ डिस्काउंट्स मिल जाता है।
मैं अक्सर फ्रंटियर के बिस्किट ले आती थी, तब वो 350 के मिलते थे, अब वो 500-600 हो गए हैं। तो अब मैं फ्रंटियर की जगह नॉर्मल जो ब्रांड्स आती हैं जो हम लोग खाते हैं, मैकविटीज़ एंड ऑल, गुड डे, मैं वो बिस्किट लाना शुरू कर दिया, तो उससे भी मेरे काफ़ी पैसे बच जाते हैं।
ऑफ़र्स ज़्यादा देखती हूँ कि कहाँ पे कुछ चीज़ों में ऑफ़र्स होते हैं, 1+1 फ्री, यहाँ पे या तो 25% डिस्काउंट, 30% डिस्काउंट। अभी 15 अगस्त का था तो कई जगह पे बहुत सारी चीज़ों पे फ्लैट 60%, 75 अप टू 75% ऑफ़र्स थे। To manage inflation, maximum what I am able to do is cut down on my expenses and trying to take up odd jobs or extra part-time jobs to increase the income. There is no other way because I have to take care of my family, home and everything.
मैं थोड़े 2 बच्चों का ट्यूशन लेती हूँ मराठी मीडियम से, उससे थोड़ा मुझे घर के लिए मदद हो जाती है। दूसरी बात तो है मैं थोड़ा सिलाई मशीन पे सिलाई के कपड़े भी सिलाई करती हूँ, तो उससे भी थोड़ी मुझे मदद मिलती है।
जैसे मान के चलो मेरे अपने पैसे बैंक में रखता हूँ, जो भी अगर मेरे पास कुछ है मैं बैंक में रखता हूँ, तो उसकी तो कोई वैल्यू नहीं है, क्योंकि 3.5% के हिसाब से मुझे इंटरेस्ट मिलेगा, तो उसका कोई मतलब नहीं है। और अगर मैं अपनी मनी को घर में रखता हूँ तो उसका भी कोई मतलब नहीं है। 5% महंगाई बढ़ रही है तो कोई यूज़ नहीं है। तो मेरा अगर अपनी इनकम को बढ़ाने का एक सॉल्यूशन ये है कि अगर मेरे पास कोई पैसे हैं, अगर मेरे को प्रॉपर्टी में सोचना है तो मैं प्रॉपर्टी अभी लेने की सोच रहा हूँ, या गोल्ड के अंदर, बिकॉज प्रॉपर्टी का ये है कि दिन पर दिन रेट और आगे हाई होने हैं।
To sum up it, all I'd say is inflation is a reality that Indian consumers have been living through, but this round is a bit different, given the challenges that COVID brought in. But our aspirations and willingness to fight through these is too strong to be dampened by inflation. This is also true for the businesses. We can all strive to grow our business, drive growth in the business, despite the challenges that inflation is posing for businesses. And I'm now going to hand over to Geeta to uncover the same with our panelists.
So thank you, Neetu. A lot of interesting data points there. And before we start with the panel discussion, I have the pleasure of introducing this distinguished panel to all of you. I'll start with Chandan.
Chandan is the Senior VP and Director at Nestle. He was a global head of insights for Nestle and had a decade-long stint at VW in Switzerland. And in earlier parts of his career, he's worked in insights function at Unilever, Central Asia and Middle East. Manjunath Desai heads insights, media and competitive strategy for Britannia. He has worked in the insights function at Colgate in the past and has also headed an insights agency in Indonesia. We also have Mahesh, and Mahesh is the insights analytics and strategy lead for L'Oreal. He's worked in strategy and insights functions at Mondelez and at Abbott Nutrition in the past. So welcome to this wonderful panel. And you heard a lot of data points that Neetu had shared. And I think we do recognize, because just earlier this week, we had a webinar, Ipsos webinar on inflation, which was a global webinar. And there, the inflation, the way people talk about inflation, the concerns are a bit amplified. Even then, what we are facing right now comes at an interesting juncture. So I want to, first of all, start off by asking you, Chandan, in what way do you feel the inflation that India is experiencing now is different from what we have experienced in the past? And because you've lived in Europe for a while, I mean, you could also contrast it with how people deal with inflation in those parts of the world. Chandan, over to you.
Well, thank you, Geeta, and thanks for this very interesting question. So first of all, like was presented, inflation is not new to India. You know, we have been living in an economy where inflation has been there. The quantum of inflation may be a little bit different at different points in time, but inflation has been there. I think what's sort of, you know, a little different about the inflation this time is that, one, it comes at the back of COVID, which already had seen quite a few, you know, different issues, and especially the mainstream consumers had a little bit of a hit because of COVID on various counts. And on top of that, there is inflation, and there is inflation across the spectrum, you know, both from essentials as well as fast-moving consumer goods, you know, whether it's cost of living, and there's a little bit of a cost of living crisis in a way, and all that, you know, is a little bit different from what it was in the past, but in the same vein of inflation coming through. You know, in other countries, they haven't had so much of inflation. This is a global inflation in a way where prices are going up across categories, across commodities, across sectors, and so on and so forth. In the West, people haven't experienced so much of, you know, inflation at one point in time. And there are, you know, certain countries where we have also seen, you know, deflation over a period of time. And when they suddenly see such kind of increases in prices, then of course it starts affecting, you know, cost of living, standard of living, and the consumption basket. And that's how it's a little different this time compared to what it has been in the past.
Thanks, Chandan. Mahesh, you look at, I would say, somewhat more premium side of things. So just I want to hear from your perspective, the way you see your target consumers responding. Do you also feel that, you know, because that milieu is different somewhat than the mass of India. So is the experience been similar for you as well?
Yeah, thanks, Geeta, firstly for the question. Very happy to be here with the rest of the panelists. So it's interesting, firstly, right, to just build on to what Chandan said, that indeed it's different, you know, the inflation this time around. While we've always been inflationary as an economy, the consumer of September 2022 is not going to be remembering the decades gone by. They're going to remember probably at best the last 4 or 5 years, which has not had such a steep inflation, right? So in that context, the pinch is very real. So the video which you showed, you know, I think it would have resonated right across everyone. Specifically to what you're asking me, indeed, there are a lot of differences that we are witnessing across different consumer cohorts. And it's often contradictory on consumer behavior on ground to, you know, sometimes what consumer says on, you know, to a claimed question response to say, okay, how do you feel about something? I don't feel so good. I mean, even the RBI data is there to prove that the confidence is not yet back. The future expectations really great. People are very optimistic, as they've always been in India. The on-ground reality is what at least folks who have had a chance to be in Mumbai over the past, say, 3 to 4 weeks would have witnessed the festivities and the kind of enthusiasm and the way in which people have celebrated and spent. Puja was coming up in the east. We know for sure almost that that's going to be a really big event. That's going to be followed by Diwali and then the wedding season. So there's a lot of pinch indeed. Food prices especially have been up. But if you look at the here and now consumer behavior, that's quite different. People are spending, and there are of course so many reasons on why that potentially is happening. There's a lot of pent up demand. There's a need to kind of express your consumption desire, which has been bottled up now for the last 2 years. So some of these conflicting, phenomena are happening, and definitely to the audience that some of the discretionary categories are speaking to, we see that a lot more, exaggerated.
So thanks, Mahesh, for that. Manju, Mahesh spoke about this dichotomy, and typically when you think of price increases, microeconomic theory, brand elasticity, you think of things like that, and how people should respond as per theory is often not what you experience in reality. So have you, in the recent past, been somewhat surprised by consumer response to a price change in your category?
Well, I think the theory is never meant to exactly replicate what happens in real life. It's meant to be a model that tries to explain the real life, and to the extent that it tries, I think they do get it right. You do, and by all accounts, consumers have responded to price increase, and not in the same measure maybe as advocated in, say, textbooks, but they have economized. There is, if you look at say the data that is published for the first quarter from our perspective, it's different for different companies, which is the AMJ quarter across different companies. It's not as if it reflected. You do see there's a bit of a pressure on volumes. The values have been all right. As Mahesh was pointing out, there's festive season coming up, and there are other facts to be noted. I think people have had found the restrictions of, say, lockdown be quite repressive, and they are living it up these days in different ways. So yes, when you look at the data without the context of what the economic theory stated, it appears as if the two of them are contradicting each other. But we got to remember two things. One is that inflation speaks of price change over a period of time, whereas most economic theories, at least the demand-supply theories, they speak of demand for a good for two different price points at the same time. So they are not exactly comparable. But as we have seen inflation keep up, there's other thing that I think we got to take note of is that a country such as India, and there are others, we do report real economic growth, which is that adjusted for inflation every year we grow 3 to 4%, and which means that the incomes are more than keeping up with the inflation. This is of course at a country level, so individually it might differ, and that's the reality as well. So there are two ways in which consumers respond. One is that every year every human being expects to do better than last year in the way they earn, in the way they spend, in the lifestyle, in the nature of what they spend it on, right? So when there is an increase which is unexpected, at least to the extent that the incomes are not caught up, they kind of moderate their own expectations, and that's what I believe you are hearing in what consumers are speaking, meaning that they expect it to be at a level this year as compared to last year. They are probably not being. They are not in a position to be at that level. I think that's the difference that you're seeing. So it appears as if they are not going as far as they wanted to. But when you look at, say, the expenditure or what the companies are reporting or what RBI itself is reporting on, say, the more high frequent measures, it's not as if things are shrunk, right? So there is still an increased expenditure. I think there are other things that are expected. So I'm not going to say that the textbooks are wrong. I think the textbooks are meant to explain in a particular context. I think they do the job quite well. It's just that when applied in a different context, they don't seem quite right. So I think the two of them are they reconcile, if not perfectly, acceptably. That's what I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Manju. I guess, there is always that ceteris paribus assumption, everything else being constant, what happens kind of thing. So talking about that, Chandan, in a time when it's not just, the category itself that you're working in or the macro category where prices are changing across, but generally across the board, there is a price change. In fact, like you pointed out, this is a period where for the first time, I think across the globe, most economies are facing this kind of a pressure. So in this sort of a atmosphere of flux, what kind of guidance can insights function in particular provide? It may be about pricing decisions, it may be going beyond pricing decision. So when you have a scenario where so many things are still not settled down, what's the contribution that insights can make in this scenario?
Well, insights can, be the guiding light in many of these kind of situations, including, inflation that we are talking about at the moment. And obviously it comes through, what I call three aspects, very simple aspects of understanding, but quite contextual in terms of understanding inflation. First of all, I think we need to understand socio-economic cultural context well. Which essentially means, what is the economic situation, what's the social situation. There is pricing and inflation, which affects pricing, but it affects and impacts different categories differently. Today, for example, while the prices of various categories is going up, it's also other kind of services which are also showing increases in prices. For example, if you look at air tickets or hotel prices or whatever. I think it's a holistic thing, and therefore people need to really understand, the socio-cultural economic context of what, pricing really means in that context, and what does consumption mean in that context, and what does the category mean in that context. And that's, of course, going to be different for different categories. So that's number one. The second area, I think, where we need to look at it holistically, and here, when we look at fast moving consumer goods in particular, like for us, I think there are certain fundamentals that, we need to look at. For example, even in an inflationary situation, in many of our categories, which are still, low to medium penetration categories, it's important that we maintain entry level pricing in categories if we were to kind of, grow those categories and increase penetration. Similarly, for other categories, which are more about, usage or depth of consumption or whatever, we need to understand how we are still able to bring in value to consumers at the right place, in the right way, so that consumers don't really drop off consumption. So I think understanding that in the category context is very, very key, and the role of the category insofar as a particular business is concerned, and also from a consumer perspective on what the role is. And thirdly, I think is all about, different kinds of pricing understanding and real pricing research and different elements and different methods and techniques in order to assess that, which is one piece of the puzzle. And now what often happens is that people just look at maybe one or two pieces of the puzzle. And what we have found to be valuable is looking at all aspects of all of this, so that you look at it, not through one lens, but through multiple lenses. And that often builds a better understanding of how you could essentially grapple with this kind of a situation. So there's a lot that insights functions can play a role in, and it depends on the task at hand. It depends on what we are trying to understand and what we are trying to grapple with. And of course, you could deploy any level of understanding towards getting to the understanding of what is the impact in a particular business or category.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chandan, you spoke about almost like this category responsibility. I want to offer that to you, Mahesh. I mean, there is this sort of task of growing the category in many situations, and therefore you have to be conscious of that when you're coming to decisions about prices. How do you think about it, given your categories are more or less in that place?
Yeah. So, it's cliche to say that you should know your consumer, but it's situations like these which are really emphasizing that. Now, we spoke about how it's a little dichotomous, the different kinds of consumer behaviors at play. The point over here is, especially for categories which are discretionary, a little premium, etc. It's more important, especially now, to recognize the fact that what economists are talking about as the K-shaped recovery is indeed at play. And then to say that, okay, they are possibly operating on the bar of that K, which is rising up, and there is a very large chunk of consumers, probably 80 to 90% of the Indian audience, which is in the lower rung. And therefore, the moment you recognize that this is your audience, the hard hit which happens to you and to the marketing partners is that every marketing dollar is going to become dearer. And unless the CMI community, the research community is now able to help target better, you're not going to be able to extract the same revenue, the same top line, the same bottom line from these audiences anymore. Because what used to be contributed by this lower rung of consumers, the less affording, rural, etc., that's not going to be accruing over the next, say, 12 to 18 month scenario possibly. And hence, every dollar is going to be, that much more expensive when it comes to the pie, which is shrinking. So this is something which I think the businesses are going to be very cognizant of. There's going to be a very big balance also to say that while price increases are, especially in the way in which Indian brands operate, pricing and promo are often seen as two different items which you can balance. So the role of promotions then start becoming very important. Businesses on brands which are relatively online will have the agility to operate promotions, because you know that there is a huge pipeline effect, lag effect on promos to help you have a response in the offline world, but that's not so online. It doesn't mean that physical availability is going to go away as an importance. We know that anywhere from 80 to 90% of businesses, even for premium products, largely operate offline. So, you have to be present so that the moment the consumers decide to express, their demand, you are there available for them to buy. So I think these are the probably different interfaces which brands and insights folk have to be cognizant of, even if it's to do with discretionary or premium categories.
So, Manju, coming to you, Mahesh spoke of this India versus Bharat K-shaped recovery, and therefore thinking on those lines as to whom are you addressing and planning strategy based on that. For your category, would that kind of a difference apply? What are some of the bigger elements that you deal with when you in a sort of a situation where across the board prices are increasing and are anticipated to increase?
Well, I think in our categories, I operate with this. What is the ratio of the most expensive, and with a certain minimum sale attributed to it, the most expensive product to the least expensive product. I mean, if you take that as a ratio, we don't tend to be as high as some other FMCG categories. We are in the mainstream of the food, amongst the highest penetrated food categories. But we do see differences in what gets consumed across regions and across different town classes. So to that extent, we see movement from one type of product to another type of product. We see that over the long run. We see that in the short run. There were massive supply disruptions during the lockdown, so that led to a fair amount of shift from one format to another format. But people respond sometimes in unexpected ways to price increases. So, and it is every time that happens, it is slightly different from the way it was the previous time. So there is that morph that happens from one time period to the other. But when we do look at this, I think we do see differences between what Mahesh called as Bharat and India. So the differences, although in my book, are driven as much by price increase as by income changes. When we speak of inflation, I think one thing that I always remind myself is that there is the supply side of inflation. For every percentage point that you say an urban dweller is paying extra for the vegetable, there is a person who's growing the vegetable who's earning a little more. And even at this stage of India's progress, we still have upwards of 50%, which depends on agriculture, either directly or indirectly on agriculture for income, right? So there is that side, which is benefits from the inflation as well. So as I was saying earlier, despite the inflation, the real incomes do grow. So there is disappointment in the market, for example, that the expected growth this year is not going to be 7.5%, but 7%. But that's real growth that we are talking about, adjusted for inflation. So we are still in a fairly good shape as an economy. So people are adjusting differently. So as much as there is inflation that we see, which is hurting people who are spending, there is also the earning side, which I think is compensating a little bit. I wouldn't say that it's completely on the other side of the spectrum. So the differences that we observe are there, but maybe not as magnified as, say, in a category which is relatively low penetrated, as what Mahesh and Mahesh's company deal with on a daily basis. So it's not as dramatically different in our case.
So Manju, there's also a question. I'm just scrolling through the chat box. There's a question on price points, and the importance of these, and the question is actually, how do you manage to hold on to 5 rupee, 10 rupee price points, which are so critical for your kind of business? So what are the, we heard that consumers do recognize that there is shrinkflation that is happening. So in that context, what do you feel, how should brands deal with this kind of a situation where you do recognize that those price points are important? At the same time, how much can you erode the value that you can give?
Actually, it's something that Chandan touched upon. There are entry level. In our case, though, it's an everyday entry, 5 rupee, or we do. I do think that it's probably the cheapest food available in the world, a 2 rupee biscuit pack, right? And these are important because they provide, say, both enjoyment and nourishment on a daily basis to a whole lot of people. Here, when we speak of price points, our experience has been that it's not just the consumer who has a point of view on that, it's also the retailer, because the logistics of being able to trade with an odd price point is the retailer's point of view becomes quite important there. So a combination of how consumers react, meaning they should be able to carry, say, a single coin or a single note and be able to complete that transaction. That's one part, and that takes care of the person who's spending. But equally, there is a person who is doing the trade from the other side, who's taking that money and then doesn't have to return or have to return. That becomes important. So maintaining price points through combination of these, both consumers' reluctance to spend a little more versus retailers' reluctance to indulge in a whole lot of exchange of coins or notes. It becomes a critical barrier for us to change. So we have to be very inventive in the ways in which we are able to maintain the price point. I don't do that job. There are people who really put both inventiveness and hard work into maintaining that price point, and it is tough. As time progresses, it becomes more and more difficult. But we have to. I think that's the necessity, and that's where innovativeness and inventiveness in how we maintain that while uh, delivering something that the consumer is still expecting becomes a challenge. But that's the challenge for our sales folks, our operations folks, including R&D. But it is something that we take very seriously because it's critical from both business perspective as well as delivering what consumers are expecting.
So, Chandan, just to bring you in on that, I think, for instance, some of the brands that Nestle offers are almost held like a barometer for inflation. What is the Maggie price, etc. So, salient brands. So, is that also an added pressure, when you come to decisions around price points and how do you maintain price points at the same time are mindful of the equity not getting eroded? So how do you deal with that challenge? I mean, I'm sure it's not easy.
Well, yeah, it's a tough thing to balance. And like Manju said, there are different pieces that have to be put into the equation. There is, of course, the cost component, and then there is the price angle, and then there is a certain margin which is there. I'm just sort of, simplifying the equation in a way. So it's important, but it's to be also looked at from a consumer perspective. If we are to kind of serve a certain consumer, and if we want to sort of, look at, of course, the brand from a brand perspective, it's important to balance it all out. It's not an easy decision. Sometimes some of these entry-level SKUs have high price awareness, and they also display some very high price sensitivity. And therefore, given that kind of a situation, it's important to maintain some key price points. There's some psychological price points. Sometimes there are players and brands and particular product categories where we have to reduce quantity and still maintain a certain serve size or a certain trips to the mouth, or maybe a certain user experience if it's still appropriate. It's also important that we understand what's the consumer value proposition in this entire angle, and how does the brand equity also play a role. We also see that brands with a stronger equity, of course, have higher pricing power. So it's also important that we maintain a certain or strengthen the brand equity as we go along in order to be able to manage prices and price increases, because products and product categories and brands will go through a certain amount of price increase given this inflationary environment, and given that inflation has been there, and given that also incomes have been growing, and there is the opportunity to be looked at. So it's a delicate balance. It's a balance of different factors. And finally, it's the human mind together with a little bit of technological support, which has to really kind of, handle this.
Yeah. So, very interesting discussion, but there is one particular question I want to ask all of you before we sort of go to the Q&A part of it. I think towards the end, Neetu also closed by pointing out, the advancement mindset that Indians have. Chandan, you spoke about it just now, that, okay, inflation has been around and, what can I do about it? My strategy is to stay ahead of it. I need to, I definitely need to be progressing in life, right? So when you keep this kind of a mindset, which is like a thread running through the, through the piece, what do you make of it? Does it impact the way you should communicate? Does it also create opportunities? Because, within Ipsos, there is a sort of a school of thought that, you can create little moments of happiness. So I want to bring you into this, Mahesh. Do you feel, what do you make of this mindset? How, are you conscious of it when you're planning for your brands and so on?
Absolutely. So especially true for, for us at L'Oreal, for I'm sure some of the other brands which cater to not just, basic needs, but the layers of, want or experience or desires which the consumers are then layering on. The fact is that in any difficult, environmental context, when consumers are making choices of premium products, of products which lead to self-indulgence, right? It's actually, there is an element of escape over there. And when that element of escape is over there, right? What they're wanting to experience, or what they're wanting to pay more for, is a feeling of saying that, I'm worth this experience, right? And it's really what L'Oreal has been talking about for many years. And hence, when we also try to reciprocate to the consumer, I think the onus on the brand is to ensure that the experience which the consumers are trying to pay for, that is kind of delivered, not just from a product standpoint, from a communication standpoint, from an education standpoint, because a lot of evolution is happening in some of the beauty categories as well, so that, this value is really justified for the consumer.
Manju, your thoughts on this? On this entire mindset that Indians have, and you're still on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think it's something that I notice not just in the context of the consumer work that I do. There's, even in the CSR work that we do, we work with those who are malnourished, and the causes of malnourishment, of course, are multitude, but a lot of times it's lack of say basic means to be able to feed the child. And even amongst them, I think the difference that I see is that people are no more looking to only contain the cost. I think a lot more people, including those down the down class strata, are looking to improve their income, and as a result, it's one of the consumers in the video said that being able to take up something on the side, additional income sources. It's a lot more common today than what I remember seeing, say, even 10, 15 years ago. So the entire thought process is now about how do I increase my income, and not so much on. So there is a greater acceptance of the fact that the cost is going to increase year on year, and that we can more than make up for it by improving our income as a result. So people are doing many things, upskilling themselves. It's something that government is encouraging quite actively. Upskilling themselves, finding other ways to do more work than before. So there are lots of these instances. So it's something that I think a growing economy does. There is faith in the fact that tomorrow is going to be better than today, and you see that across the spectrum. And as a result, people seem to be less concerned with inflation today than, say, 30 years ago. You don't have movies which had people protesting against Mahanga anymore. It's a lot more about how do I improve my income. So I think that's something that is there. It is reflective of a growing economy. It's also reflective of an economy that has greater confidence in tomorrow, and is looking less at the past. So I think that's something that we see.
So Chandan, to complete the full circle and come back to you on this mindset, what do you make of it? You did speak about, recognizing the socio-economic context as much as the social context as much as the economic context. So in what ways can marketers factor in this positive, optimistic advancement mindset that Indian consumers seem to be largely having?
Right. I think it sort of, from my perspective, it finally boils down to who is your target consumer that you're looking at. And India is a multi-tier kind of a multi-tier income pyramid, and a multi-tier consumption pyramid as well. And therefore, on one side, when you have sort of consumers at the more developing end of the pyramid, then of course, you have to take into account their context and their mindset and their aim to sort of, improve the quality of their lives and so on and so forth. And therefore, there is a certain role that brands have to play, categories have to play in doing that. So when somebody, consumes let's say a pack of noodles at that particular price point, it's obviously something that a child or a teenager or somebody else in the household consumes it. And therefore, we have to factor that into account and make that available at the right price for that consumer for meeting the aspiration of that consumer. And on the other side, in this inflationary situation, we have all seen in some of our categories, for example, or even, you look at some of the media reports and all of that, that the premium end of the market is also kind of, increasing and going up, even if there is an inflationary situation, because that's a very different consumer. And there are certain aspirations about that consumer, which the consumer has. And, categories have different kind of elasticities and different kinds of, aspirational value. And therefore, it's also important that we meet the needs of those consumers at the end of the day. So if we kind of, have this understanding of who is the target consumer and what's really valued, then this can help us unlock this, this mindset and understand what can we do, which is more fit for purpose, looking at the inflation, but more broadly, looking at how do we really delight consumers and enhance their lives.
I mean, as much as I sort of hate to break this up, there are lots of questions. We are nearing the end of the allotted hour, so I would like to sort of take up a few questions and share those with you. And in no particular order, I'll be able to ask a few questions, not all, and we'll try and get answers to all of you back from the panelists. So this is a question from Jyoti Jayaraman, and anybody can please respond to it. For high ticket price items, furniture, and so on, to what extent do consumers notice inflation impact in price points of high ticket items, since the frequency itself is lower? And if it is noticed, does it change the behavior much? What would be the strategy recommendation in this case? I recognize it's a little bit unfair to, two of you here, but maybe Mahesh, you can answer this.
Definitely. I mean, I can opine, although we still are not so infrequent a category of purchase. But yes, so the couple of things which at least is happening right now. One is some of the large ticket items, while not on furniture, typically this automobile sales is used as an economic indicator. It was expected to not go up, but it is actually picking up in a dramatic way over the last few months. It seems to be more about deferred consumption or deferred purchase in this case. So indeed, it was planned. Inflationary impact is yet to hit it. There is this entire festive, optimism also, which is driving it. Outlook on it doesn't seem to be so positive, though, getting into the Q1, etc. of next year. So indeed, as far as consumer response is concerned, it seems to be planned. But they are, the inflationary impact on deferred purchases is definitely going to be there. I don't think the plans are likely to get shelved, unlike in the case of, brand shifts, etc., which may happen on everyday or monthly consumption items. But there is likely to be difference in these categories.
Okay. There's another question quite relating to what you spoke about earlier, Manju, on the coinage and the price point bit. So this question is from Vidya Aital. With increasing number of people getting onto digital payments, UPI, etc., are we breaking the barriers on non-magic price point? A chocolate or a biscuit at 6 or 7 rupees or 12 or 13 rupees was a barrier some time ago. Wouldn't that change going forward? Wouldn't that, this entire notion of price points, which is based on hard currency?
No, I think we should expect it to change. If you shop anywhere else in the world, I would say non-Asia, non-Africa, it's not uncommon for people to pay $1.99 and $3.49, etc. So it does happen. Of course, if you were to tender that money in the US stores, you will get by 1 cent. You may not have that luxury in India. I think it would change. The other thing that does matter is whether the product is bought by itself or it is part of, say, a basket. And when I'm saying basket, I'm not saying a monthly basket that constitutes of 20 or 25 items. It could be just 2 or 3 of them. So whether the odd coinage gets subsumed in a larger transaction value or not. In many cases, wherever it is a single trade item, a trading item, it does get impacted. But I think as time passes and people are getting more and more accustomed to and are using digital currency, it should come down, and that barrier should come down. But regardless of how often, say, people like us use the digital currency, it is still not as common as it is, say, in the urban areas. Living in Bangalore, I got, a vegetable vendor accepting digital currency, but just go outside of the mainstream. It is not as common. So we are talking about an impact to the tune of, say, 5%, 10%, 12%. And all that it takes is a quarter of people not being on digital currency for it to impact. And I think that's what decides whether you do it at all or not. So until we cross that barrier where pretty much everybody is on digital currency, I think the concern about odd price points will continue to impact the decisions that we make.
Great. So there are more questions, and I'm tempted to take one last question on from Emmanuel. What do you think of the role of innovation and perceived product uniqueness? Are they keeping in strong momentum with consumers in the inflationary times? So is innovation and the aspect of making your offering unique, is it keeping pace with the inflationary times? And any one of you can take it. And that would be, I think, the last question we'll be able to accommodate today. Chandan, you want to take a stab at it?
Well, sure. So I think, whether or not there is inflation, I think there is scope for innovation all the time, and scope for, all those different vectors that we're being talked about all the time. So we should not wait for inflation to come in before we start innovating or before we start kind of looking at what are the opportunities for innovation. I think innovation by itself is a big enough stream. We should be looking at different aspects of where we could innovate, where we could address consumer needs, latent consumer needs, and so on. But of course, when there is an inflationary situation, sometimes, as a tactic, some of the product categories may think about valuing up and increasing price at the same time, so that consumers see that there is an added feature or added benefit or an added innovativeness in a particular product or an added uniqueness, which also tries to justify a price increase or also tries to, create more value around a price increase. And that is, one of the tactics which is used. Again, differs by product category on what you could do and what you could not do and so on and so forth, but is definitely a lever worth considering.
So I think we've come to the end of the hour, and I want to thank this wonderful panel for such an absorbing and insightful discussion. There's a lot of comments in the chat box, but we will, it's 1 minute over 1 o'clock. We will bring this discussion to a close. But before I go, there were some questions about whether this data, this deck, recording, etc. will be made available. Yes, we'll share it with everybody who's joined the webinar today. And for any further information on the data that you saw or any questions you have around this topic, do feel free to reach out to Neetu and Dheeraj at the email IDs that you can see on your screen, and we'll also mail that back to you. And do look out for a note where we'll summarize some of the great thoughts, some of the interesting ideas that we heard today in this discussion on inflation. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And for those of you in India, have a nice lunch and have a great weekend. And we'll talk to each other again soon. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.